So, welcome. I think we're up and running. I usually start around noon, so a little bit early, but I'm still trying to understand a little more about how to work this podcasting system. And I apologize for sort of the unprofessional way this is, but I hope it still has value. So, welcome back. I'm Darlene Rollins, and this podcast is on everything Earth Walkways. And by that I mean, how does one navigate this soul journey called life? And that's life here on this planet of initiation and transformation. And how nature, can also be a guide and there's a kind of new understanding of the cosmic intelligence, something, that I think all of nature is kind of helping us tap into more and more. So, it's an exciting time to kind of recover a deeper understanding of who we are as human beings and where we are in this planet Earth and when we are in these times. So, um, we're going to do a little more on the soul journey aspect from our last podcast later, but this week, I want to explore one of the dualities that we get caught in that makes our soul journey challenging. And I've been sort of exploring this as I've been sort of in this deep mode of hibernation during this cold spell and this freeze that we've had, and sort of limited, wanting to get out and capability to get out and, be very active. So, I was really relishing it for a while, and then I noticed that there was a part of me that felt like, well, maybe that's too much, or I'm gonna start stagnating, or sort of, part of me just wanted to hibernate the whole time. And so it was an interesting study, and I find that this lecture actually addresses this in a good way that can help us learn both how to trust and listen deeply to this inner process of ours around being active and sort of the doing aspect of life, and then the resting, the receptive, the being aspect, and how there's a way that we've created a duality, and we want to try to reharmonize that and balance that again and again. In Earth Walkways, it's always about balancing the opposites, it seems to me. So here we are, just past the cross quarter day of February 2nd, right? Uh, Halfway now to the spring equinox. And this is the time known as Imbolc, the stirring in the belly, the first stirring of new life, but still deep within the womb of the earth. So you might call it like the quickening moments. And that's in, I think originally it was a festival of the lambs, the new stirring of the lambs within the mother sheep. But I think it has this beautiful metaphor for this time. So, this renewal and inner movement, the stirring of the life force that heralds a coming time of expansion and birthing a whole new life, or a new project, or a new year. And so it's noted in our culture, and of course we have Grandfather's Day or whatever. We celebrate, to some degree, but it's even equinox is really just a part of the ordinary backdrop of life and the ground of being, and that's a blessing. And I think we're all held and informed by that. But there's a way that if we can consciously get more present and become a little more aware of it, I think it enriches and propels our, journey of evolution in consciousness. So, we want to allow the power of the new life that breaks through stone, right? I mean, that's literally sort of the image that came to me in one of my hymns, this life force that is so strong that, the green plants seem to break right through stone. And sometimes they do, they come up through cracks in the sidewalk and that kind of stuff. So um, I think it's a beautiful metaphor as well, to understand the tremendous power of this force and then the miraculous nature really of being here, thing that we miss. And I'm going to welcome Abby Corman. Hey, welcome, Abby. I'm just kind of rapping a little bit about these times, and I have a Pathwork lecture I'm going to share a little bit. So, welcome to join in, and feel free if you have questions or comments to stop me. So, so this is this understanding I have of sort of this miraculous nature of life that again, we're sort of numb to, or we're not fully present to, and it's a part of the pleasure, I think, and the deep experience of life that we long for, and that sort of feels missing when we're disconnected from it. But our journey is one that has been a kind of movement towards reconnection, and so we're all in different places along that path. And this other part of it is our sensory presence, because like all of this you know uh, experience of life is really an experience. And so when we try to just understand it with our mind, or we just try to live through our mental images of things, I think we also disconnect from the body, and that's part of our nature. And so I find that it's really a beautiful practice whenever I can, just to come back to my sensory here now moment, and just notice whatever that is, and if I have a moment to relax into it, to let it even hold me, because what I usually notice when I come into my sensory moment is that a part of me has been tensed and activated, and I'm sort of in this one of the things we're going to explore today, sort of this overactive doing aspect of our uh, distortion of this lecture, that is actually called mobility in relaxation, right? And so we usually have mobility that's tense, and then the relaxation is a kind of collapse. So, and then we struggle between those two poles because neither of them quite work. And so there's this balancing that we're going to talk about today. So, this renewal and inner movement, the stirring of the life force that heralds a new time of expansion and birthing, said a new life, a new project, a new year. All of that is, a powerful time of opening again, almost like the newborn of anything, with our Zen awareness, right? Our Zen mind, where it all just is, and we're not in our place of needing to judge or defend, or, but just to kind of notice what everything feels like. So, and when we can do that, there's this, just beautiful creation that, we can notice that is brought about almost moment by moment by this life force flowing and expanding, and seeking the pleasure of being and also of doing here on earth, right? There's this natural pleasure that, because of our confusion and distortion, that we miss out on. And the pleasure current, the life force is the pleasure principle, is the pleasure current. And there's a way that all addiction and all sort of our restless seeking is because we're disconnected from the deep pleasure that is really available for us here. And I include myself. I work within a deepening experience, but I also am aware, oh, there's so much more here that I'm not yet sufficiently sensitized to, or I'm not, open enough to in some way. And so, we're moving towards finding a joining in of this flowing, expanding, and um, opening movement of the life force that is the true nature of pleasure. So this ever renewing moment and movement shows us like this, the life force, the way it is within and all around us. And when it flows freely and naturally, it does create this pleasure. But our polarities here create, like an either or confusion within us. And this is because, while the life force is the pleasure of freedom and uh, being incarnate in life, life has both pleasure and pain. And so this kind of issue, naturally our sensitivity, contracts or retracts away from what's here that seems unpleasant, difficult. And and so we naturally want to resist this pain. But then that's how we are unconsciously blocking sort of the positive flow of the life force. And then as we contract against some negative experience, since the life force is pleasure itself, we will like attach pleasure to that negative experience. And there's a way that this partly is what in this lecture, they're saying, like keeps us recreating or stuck in certain ways, not able to transform certain negative circumstances or patterns in our lives. Um, so we're going to explore today these concepts through this Pathwork lecture, mobility and relaxation. And that's really the description of kind of this state that I would say we're calling flow these days, right? It's like people talk about this amazing state of flow where, they're focused and yet they're like very present, and there's a kind of lack of attention and control. It's like you're unified with something larger that's, a part of this uh, experience. And so suffering then comes, that would be the natural way that, and then suffering is brought about through a sort of attachment of the pleasure of the life force to certain negative, painful, difficult situations that we encounter. And the Pathwork Guide says this is, a part of, survival. He says, like, we really can't live without, the life force, which is life, which is pleasure. And so, like, when we are experiencing either, hurting, being hurt ourselves, or, hurting others, sometimes there becomes an attachment to some pleasure in that, the pleasure of the life force. And he's saying that that's one of the reasons why we are, have to work a little deeper within us to uncover and unravel some of these unconscious currents and kind of restore. It's like the healing of the pleasure current within us. And of course, in our culture, a lot of things, we were taught we're not allowed to, even though they seem pleasurable and good. It's a whole big topic. But this lecture, I think, boils it down in a useful way. So, um, and again, we naturally resist pain. But when we do that, then we're unconsciously blocking the positive flow of the life force. And as we contract against some negative experience, um, since life force is pleasure, then we're going to find pleasure in the negative experience. And this will hold the negative circumstances in place. So, the suffering through the attachment of the life force to negative situations is the subtitle. And to me, this lecture speaks of what is being called the state of flow. Talked a little bit about that. And so our work is to recognize where we block or attach our life force to a resistance to life. And even being born, right, carries great stress and even trauma. We're extremely sensitive beings, and especially when we're, you know, infants, and so there's even this kind of nature of life, this is to find a way to go forward. And sometimes that way is, to work with the pleasure, this pain of the stress and the hardship by way of sort of identifying with it. We begin to identify with our stories of our struggle and suffering, and this kind of also this identification and this kind of maybe attachment to, there's an energy, a positive life force energy we get in complaining about things, and I feel that, a lot. And, sort of, so there's a way that we're, sort of misdirecting this life force in these negative ways. But in a sense, if we can detect and recognize both the pleasure and the attachment to that pleasure, it will help us ultimately shift and kind of rewire ourselves. So sometimes, maybe even often, life seems hard and it's a struggle. And while certain things feel creative and transcendent, exciting, and, enjoyable, a lot of other experiences are sort of full of drudgery and unpleasantness. And because of this, we kind of get caught in a duality that is fundamental to all of our struggles. And this is part of what the lecture is going to bring out. So I'm going to go ahead and share it in a little bit. I'm going to try to do this new thing with a whiteboard and see if that will work. I don't like the way, sharing my screen works anymore on this. So we'll see. But the first part of the lecture describes, the state that we are calling flow. And it talks about the promise that when we find our inner real self in its true balance, that both movement and rest can be balanced and, wonderful and deeply pleasurable. And we don't have to have tension in the movement, and we don't have to then feel like we have to collapse, in the non-movement. And there's a bubbly, pleasurable life force, even if it's not directed in sort of the non-movement state. And oftentimes, because of our duality, we kind of don't have this unification of this mobility, again, the movement, while we're relaxing, while we're just in a flow. Kind of, I have a hymn that talks about, like, forgive my impatience when I want to push the river, and then the spirit says, relax, you can let it carry you. It's like there's this way that we're always in a little bit of this tension of the forcing current, is what the guide calls it. And where we have this forcing current, it's a place that we can explore a little more deeply in ourselves, because something is trapped that can be set free. And so this feels like a good place to start this morning. And, let's see if we can learn how to melt the ice that's all around. I don't know if, I guess where you are too, Abby, that, and it's sort of, we've had this massive winter storm that I think is like a large part of the U.S. And then, we've also had all of these ice agents, that are frozen in sort of negative pleasure as well, and that kind of thing. So, it seems like, I don't know, again, how the world mirrors how everything is sort of interconnected, right? So this lecture explores the way that we attach the powerful pleasure principle to certain negative, defensive, and separating impulses. And that's what makes it hard for us to let go into the pleasure principle. And I think I'll come back to that. Let's go ahead and start the lecture here. I'm going to see if I can now figure out how to do this whiteboard thing. Oops, now something is different. Did this before. Ah, there it is. Seems like it's. Can you see that at all, Abby?
I can see like half of it. Like it
Yeah,
could be pushed over to your right to there you go.
yeah.
That's better.
Okay, so let me see if I can then also. It's like we're not at the beginning of this lecture. So this is just basically I kind of copy pasted into this whiteboard the beginning of this lecture. It's not the entire lecture. I don't think we would have time to get through it, but so hopefully this way you can kind of follow along as well. Sometimes people like to read as well as listen. So um, this is from lecture 135, I believe, in the Pathwork guide lectures, and you can access these. They're all free online through pathwork.org. So it says the entire universe is permeated with a vibrant life substance. This substance consists of forces of such tremendous power that people have only begun to discover them only vaguely and to a limited degree. Whether this power be physical, such as electrical or atomic power, or mental power, makes no difference, for it is all the same power, or different facets of the same power. This power is a very impressionable mass, a substance that can be governed and molded by consciousness. So, and I think, more and more, the whole quantum physics is, really aligning under this understanding that there is this quantum layer of existence that, is a part of what is impressed, is impressionable, is, molded by consciousness. And the guide uses, that word as well. So the result of this molding is matter in its various degrees of density. It is also something more subtle than particular matter, however, because it's life itself as it unfolds for the individual. It's our experience, it's our conditions, our circumstance, fate, and destiny, if you will. So it's like it's more than just, like uh, the matter that we're molding, right? It's like this is the journey in a way. It's like we're creating, in a sense, our own soul journey. Let's see if I can get this where it'll scroll down. Yeah. So the result of molding is matter in its varying degrees of density. I just read this, but I'm going to repeat it because I think it's a good point. It's also something more subtle than particular matter. It is life itself as it unfolds for the individual. It is experience, it is condition, circumstance, fate, or destiny, if you will. Whatever you experience in the conditions in which you find yourself, this is the matter or form which is the outcome of the way consciousness impresses the life substance. This is a very, very brief recapitulation of everything I've spoken about in other lectures, basically. This tremendous life substance is in continuous motion. Let us go a little more deeply into the meaning of this, into the particular method and rhythm of this cosmic movement. If you truly understand this, you do indeed have another key to your life. This cosmic movement, permeating everything, is a mixture of mobility and relaxation. The key of mobility combined with relaxation opens the world. It is the state of being or the unitive principle of being. So imagine this state and living within it where your doing is a flow and your being is resting in the flow. And the doing then arises out of that from moment to moment, and is like held in this awareness of being. And there's no stress or forcing current or tension needed, you know, uh, and there's no resistance to movement as well. So, this is something that, it's an interesting thing in some of the classes and stuff where we look deeper into our own experiences of this and share that. So if you feel like you want to share anything, if this connects for something in you, Abby, you're welcome.
Well, I was thinking when you were reading that, it reminds me that I take a little chapter of the Tao every week in the beginning of my week, and just keep that page. What I just kind of randomly find a page, and whatever that page is, I keep it open for the week. And what you just read reminds me, I got the same feeling that I get when I read a chapter of the Tao.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the other thing that I always love about, like all of the spiritual stuff is that it's everywhere. The same wisdom is in all of the traditions, and definitely, the whole concept of, when the guide talks about unity and duality is very much, foundational and sort of the Taoism and the Tao Te Ching and all of that. So, yeah, so it's a lot of focus on non-dual and stuff like that as well. So I find that this kind of way that he breaks it down and kind of talks about, like the sort of attachment of the pleasure principle, and then, kind of bridges the inner child work to me, that sometimes they seem to be kind of two separate paths. There's the non-dual path, and then there's the you know child work, inner child work, and that's fine too. But I think sometimes really they are interconnected, and I find that this lecture seems like a little bit of a bridge to bring both together, and also to understand sort of our addictions and our uh, lower self aspects in some of this. So yeah. So he says it's our misconception that creates duality, and through misconception, duality and conflict come about. And the particular duality or distortion of the unifying principle of mobility and relaxation results in the following misconception. So, like like a lot of times, like everything is sort of this unified both and thing in reality. But the mind, trying to uh, seek pleasure and avoid pain, sort of starts to divide the world into these two things: good, bad, right, wrong, okay, not okay, and so then when we do that, we create these splits, and then these splits are kind of like interesting because they kind of have a piece of truth, but a piece of distortion because they're split, in the thing, and so there's a kind of, I think, useful working out sometimes and conscious recognition of what's happening in that. And he talks about a particular one in this lecture. It kind of happens in various ways where we, kind of go into duality. But um, so he's saying, that the particular duality or distortion of the unifying principle of mobility and relaxation results in the following misconception. On the one hand, relaxation is viewed as non movement or stagnation. So, like oftentimes I think in our culture, like we don't really know how to relax. We have difficulty knowing how to really let down because, you know, maybe we're like longing for it to such a degree that we're afraid we'll never get back up again, or, like there's a certain kind of way that sometimes people who have never been able to get their activity, very grounded and supportive for them, they kind of have a tendency to drift into a kind of stagnation, and non-movement feels safe, right? And so then we go for the comfort, and the movement is risky, and so we kind of end up, uh, yeah, slowing everything down in our evolutionary process, basically. And then on the other hand, motility or mobility is viewed as tense effort. And so, I notice just how unconsciously, even, I go into, doing something around the house or whatever. And, like, especially if I'm getting ready for an event that does have a kind of time limit to do everything that, seems like a million things, I tend to sort of, I can feel my energy projecting in front of myself. I get tense in my body, and I'm kind of like leaning forward doing, in this kind of tense effort of doing mode. And we might even notice that in other ways, right? In other situations, right? Where do you um I think in a lot of instances, we have to tense because we're trying to uh, move ourselves out of the stagnation. And so we think we have to use our outer will to push ourselves, to make ourselves go. And that doesn't usually work in a healthy way either. You might get some movement, but again, it's the opposite of this real yes current, which is what the life principle is the fundamental, yes. And where there's resistance to something, it creates this kind of duality and this split. And so then mobility is viewed as tense effort. And then if we understand these misconceptions, we can understand a lot of humanity's predicament. All misconceptions, as you find them in the course of your personal work, are derivatives of this particular duality. So I think it's an interesting thing, that like this is a kind of fundamental duality that he's pointing to, and that all other dualities have elements of this. So relaxation can exist only in non movement. That is stagnating passivity, as opposed to a movement that is a tense, anxious, grabbing, striving effort. Seemingly, you have to decide between these two alternatives. And so, whenever you're torn between those two alternatives, strife is going to follow. It's a result of conflict because, in a way, they're both not a real good solution. They're sort of damned if we do, damned if we don't, or what I sometimes call a death, right? There's not a life giving answer here that we're naturally seeking. And so we feel sort of the logjam in it, but we don't know and we don't understand. And that's what I love about the pathwork, is that it's very useful in helping us understand what the forces are and the cause of all of this and how to unravel it. So here, transcending this duality and reaching the unitive principle of being becomes necessary. Needless to say, this applies to all levels of personality. I cannot sufficiently emphasize that my talks are not in the least abstract philosophical discourses, but very practical guideposts to your immediate life, my friends. Don't overlook this fact. Let us begin right here and right now to see how this holds true. When you examine the misconceptions, the images, as they unfold through your pathwork, and you look at these misconceptions deeply enough, you are bound to find that they fall into this split. Even from a merely intellectual approach, you should easily see that the distortion of mobility and relaxation is the primary duality of all underlying misconceptions. So this may not be as clear to people because he's referring to these misconceptions, these images. He says what happens, to consciousness in its very young period of time, is that it has experiences, and of course as the ego develops, it's trying to protect itself from negative experiences and seek positive experiences, and so it tries to figure out the rules, and it tries to make generalizations, and so it'll have an experience that was maybe even true to that experience, but then if it generalizes it, and then it's in a projection, right? And so this is a part of how we are sort of recreating certain aspects of our early childhood experience, is that the mind is trying to protect itself by figuring it out, and like learning the rules, and you know seeing what it can generalize so it can know what's safe and what's not safe, what's good and what's bad. And so again, it's a natural sort of survival function, but because it is like an essentially, by definition, an overgeneralization, and it gets applied and kind of superimposed on actual reality, then it actually has the effect of creating that expected reality when, if we didn't have, it superimposed, but we were able to just be in the present, we would probably not, we would probably discover that this was not exactly the same experience we had before. But when we don't stay in the present with it and we bring the past into the present, is what happens as we are, then expecting it to look a certain way, even unconsciously. We may not even be aware of it. But that expectation creates a whole sort of string of connected events. It's like if we expect it, we unconsciously are defending against it. And it seems that the defense itself actually, will draw it out or manifest it or, attract it in some way. So, there's this way that there's this kind of vicious circle that gets created as we try to protect ourselves from a past suffering, through these defenses and through these overgeneralizations of our experience. And again, for many years, we're going to do that. It's a part of a long learning curve that we have in incarnation. But, usually at some point, we can begin to challenge and also just learn, through meditation or other things, like this other doorway of consciousness, which is, our mind is in the past or in the future. Our immediate experience is what's present. And, we can, like just be with that. And that opens a new possibility, right? And a new lens in which to view life from that, may be aware of the past, but it also has the capacity to kind of crack the cosmic egg. It doesn't have to recreate it from that place. And so, as we can again, that's kind of the state of being, the state of just being with what is and not trying to defend against it, trying to project what we think is coming and that kind of thing. That um, out of that state of being, natural doing will respond, and it will come from a deeper discernment of what is instead of what we're afraid of or what we believe might be or something like that. So as we sit more with in the state of being, a deeper discernment also, takes place within the flow of the universe, right? Like we're a part of something bigger than us. And so we're listening. This is part of what I call deep listening. We're listening to what that um, moment is bringing, and if we're really present, then it guides us in this way of sort of intuitively knowing, or maybe we actually have beings talking to us or whatever, but we usually have a discernment or a sense of being called forth, with something or not in any given situation. And so then again, sort of the mobility comes out of inspiration, out of this rising, heart connected movement in the moment. And it, you know in the beginning, maybe as we're learning to trust it, can have some tension or whatever, since we're risking, any kind time we move, we're risking coming into life, engaging, and a lot of us, that can be scary, and we've had bad experiences when we've done it before. So, we're like learning how to kind of surf this and trust it deep inside and listen, and then where we, are aware that, we don't trust it, or, we have these expectations, there's a work that you can do, to just excavate all of that and bring it into the light of consciousness and acknowledge and integrate it, and it can transform. So, continuing with this lecture, uh, oops. So the distortion creates this death thing that I was talking about, an impossible choice. And we seem to get stuck between two equally unwanted experiences. Usually taking, we kind of have a temptation and a traditional sort of long, slow death, which is the avoidance of the short, quick death. And so we don't recognize sometimes even that it's the same death, or, an equally, you know, problematic death, because it's kind of like the one that we're avoiding seems like, yeah, if I do that, it's the end of the world, right? And so our defense against that, you know, actually, it helps us to see, oh, if I continue this way, though, it's going to lead to another death. And so, again, we take the path of least resistance, but if we can look deeper, there's divinity and distortion on both sides of the split. And so there's a distortion of stagnation within the extreme pole of resistance, but this is never going to feel relaxing. And there's a way of relaxing into the momentum of the moment and choosing a path of relaxing into the movement and the current of the flow. But we have to kind of attune to it in a way and be present to it. And then on the other side is the forcing current, which, thinks that we should and wants, is trying to make us move as we think we are supposed to, and what the mind believes is correct. And it's also pushing against sort of this feared non-activity, because it's like, it's a risk to act again in life. And so there's always this kind of counter pull back within us. And so again, it almost feels like, well, if I don't push myself forward, we're not going to go anywhere, right? And so this, fear of movement, and then, the fear of non-movement is sort of like what we're in this dualistic, trap within. And there's a natural activity that arises again out of clarity and inspiration, that can say yes to the movement and trust the forces of life to carry the movement, if we, like practice and have a little effort on steering. And we have to again move through some fear, but it's like there's a way that the universal curriculum, once we say yes, will, find a gentle and beautiful way to help us. And then the active current can unite with the relaxation and expansion impulse. And there's a way that, we're basically trying to remember and reprogram over this old program that we have. And so, it takes practice. It's like we're going to get it and lose it and get it again. But as we find it more and more, we deepen into the natural, habit again of that way. So the guide says you will experience this truth even more dynamically and personally when you listen to your soul movements, your own inner expression and emanations. If you calmly observe what emanates from your own psychic forces, you will find this distortion of movement where you stagnate because non movement seems so tempting. It appears to be the effortless state that your soul longs for. And on the other side, movement, seems so necessary because you don't want to stagnate, and then guilt whips you into a striving, overly tense movement. And you may not even be able to put your finger on exactly what you strive so hard for. When observing the state of your own psychic emanation, you will be able to pinpoint this particular dichotomy. So I don't know if you can kind of go inside and notice these two forces within. Um, People are, sometimes able to do this, and then other people are not used to working in this field so much of our energy and our sensory experiences in the moment. But, we can often feel like, most of us have been busy, or, dealing with the snow or something. So there might be like this kind of stagnation impulse that, just wants to hibernate. It's hard to get out and do much, so it doesn't really want to put that effort forth. And then maybe there's another part of you that then also, feels like, oh, if we don't get going here, we'll we might fall into this hole and never get out of it, or we'll have a big backlog of things we should have done and we haven't done. And so this kind of forcing current, this pressure that is now kind of trying to help the stagnant part move, but we don't realize that like when we kind of come after it, pushing it like that, oftentimes its response is just to like tense down or hunker down, and so now we're spending a lot of energy, sort of trying to control and move ourselves, like our should is not really a yes current, and it's trying to push against basically a no current inside of us that says, I don't, I'm not into this, I don't want to, I don't want you pushing me, and so that resistance then, uh, is oftentimes what we find, when we think we should use our outer will to accomplish something that our mind or our understanding thinks is appropriate and right, and so then the outer will always, I think, is a kind of forcing current to some degree. I think we have an inner intention, and we can go deep inside and we can, make our choice. It's like a free will choice that chooses something. But the pushing of the outer will is a part of the imbalance that we're trying to learn how to let go of more and more. And and so how do we accomplish anything if we don't push ourselves? Is kind of sometimes what people feel inside. Like, oh, if I let go of that, I won't ever do anything, right? um, but that's ultimately not true. And part of the feeling of just never wanting to do anything comes from the fact that you're always pushing. And so there's this inner duality and dichotomy that, is kind of an inner war conflict between these two parts that goes on unconsciously. We're not even so aware of it. But it's exhausting, and it doesn't really resolve or get us anywhere. And again, we have a certain, and this lecture talks about an attachment of the pleasure principle than to this kind of stuckness in a way, right? Because we have to have pleasure, and the non-movement, usually the pleasure is in the movement, right? So then there's ways that we begin to sort of identify, maybe with a victim, or even with sort of the part of us that like the guide says in this lecture, basically that pleasure does get attached to, ultimately, to being hurt or hurting. And so like if we're identified with the part that was hurt and kind of identified with the victim, there's a certain pleasure, negative pleasure or attachment or identification. and and then if sometimes we're so afraid of being the victim that we have to become the perpetrator, or like we want to be tougher, we feel like we have pleasure in the hurting of others and others suffering, and get to compare and think, oh, I'm a better than that, and that kind of thing. So there's this dichotomy that we have, where pleasure gets tripped into these negative um, expressions, and so there's like a negative attachment, and a negative intentionality of the pleasure. And he's saying that basically, to free ourselves, we have to be aware of it, and then you know discover the truth of the power and the beauty of positive pleasure, because the part of us that attached to that negative pleasure didn't have the option, right, and didn't know, and it's just a kind of old programming and habit from our early childhood. And in some ways, the whole system, that's what we're doing in this work, in some senses, is trying to reprogram. And it's not that the program was faulty. It's like we came in and that was the perfect program that we chose, but we chose to go in and descend into that difficulty and that negative programming, and then find our way to something higher. And so in some ways, it's all in divine order, that we're exploring all of this, and it's not to be looked at through eyes of shame or blame or anything like that, but just kind of this curiosity and this self-knowledge, this recognition that and really beautiful freedom of, oh well, if so much of this is part of my own projection, then I can like, I'm not sentenced forever to have my faults or deficits or whatever. I can transform and grow and mature, basically, is what the guide is saying, is that consciousness, all of us have varying levels of consciousness. And not individually, but within an individual. I mean, yes, individually as well, but within an individual, we all have different levels of consciousness. And so in some ways we're using our more developed aspects of consciousness to help mature and support and develop the less mature aspects. And we often came in bringing parts that needed some support in that. So let's see. So we tried to explore this a little, and so it's important for the moment that you can just acknowledge all of this, and then sort of accept it, right? The observation or awareness, it's not something again to judge or and so slowly but surely you come nearer to seeing the imbalance and straightening it out. And if we judge or shame, then we're not gonna be able to work with it. So as you proceed in reorienting your until recently unconscious but now conscious misconcepts, values, understanding of life and yourself, as well as your relationship to life and to yourself, the movement begins to harmonize with the great cosmic flow. Mobility and relaxation comes more and more into being. A deeper truth from the higher self can help you question your conclusions, even if they seem so obvious from experience. Remember, you are programming these experiences into your life unintentionally because you're not aware of that. And then the same applies to the physical level of existence. As you observe the emanation of your thinking, feeling, and reacting, and consequently observe this particular imbalance, you will also see that the same imbalance affects your physical body. So all of these things are, totally interconnected. Since the principle of life itself is the harmony between mobility and relaxation, the phenomenon of dying must be the misunderstanding of this principle, so that a duality arises. And when this misunderstanding has proceeded far enough, affecting more and more aspects of the entity, the phenomenon of dying takes place on the outer levels. Where this balance is established, life continues, and death is an impossibility. The outer physical levels follow suit automatically as the psychological imbalance is straightened out. This does not mean, however, that you cannot also help from outside in, by cultivating and learning from without the art of mobility and relaxation. So this is where I think a lot of today's, Tai Chi, and, we have a lot of different practices of movement, meditation, and just movement in general, and, kind of free form exploration of, and then just even I kind of practice like when I can remember, and I'm not under time pressure a lot, like to be aware when I'm consciously, actively doing something, and to check in and feel like, okay, is there a forcing current? Is there a tension? Or am I in a flow? And oftentimes there's certain conditions that help me, and ways of relaxing my body, opening my body a little bit in the morning, doing some meditation. I think a lot of people find this useful, but even if you don't, like, I know a lot of, I have some ADHD, and sometimes, like the routine doesn't happen, and yet just a few minutes, of following my breath, of connecting inside, of, you know getting into my being present, And being present always kind of means feeling embodied and connecting to, this moment now through the breath, through the body. If you're not in your sensory in some way, you're probably thinking, and it's like they're very different domains in a way. It's only in the sensory present is the now happening. And so if we want to practice, being in the now, it's like kind of noticing. And that's also the whole journey of integrating, right? To notice what's here now, where the life force is, what it's doing, where it's contracting, where it's expanding, where it's, feeling heavy, where it's, feeling shamed. There's many, many different expressions inside of us of this energy. And some people may feel it kinesthetically, some people may have more visual, imagery about things like this. If you can embody it on a kinesthetic level to some degree and just practice experiencing, grounding, feeling your feet on the ground, being in the body, feeling the energy in your body, um, that is also a good practice. And, some people, again, are natural at it. And then, I mean, I don't have hardly visual at all. So, I can understand that, when people say, I don't know how to do that because I don't know how to see anything, right? So, but to feel, is kind of something that does really help us um, come into the moment now, just even by paying attention to our breath, like following the breath into the body and into the present moment is, it's always here, it's always now. And if we bring our attention, and that's really what it is it's a shift of attention. We're so used to having our attention on our interesting thoughts and it's just kind of habit. And so we have to recognize, oh, my attention needs to shift and pay attention to something here in the physical, in the body, in this moment. And then as you kind of anchor your attention there, then you begin to discover there's vast realms of, interesting, energy, information, experiences, that you can explore and learn from in that. And so, that's part of how we're going to like physically practice, you know, cultivating this art of mobility and relaxation. It's just, to notice when you're tense and invite yourself to relax and then invite yourself to continue with whatever, you were going to do, but see if you, can support yourself and not tensing back up again. And there's some tension that's needed for movement. It's like, so it's kind of like this subtle discernment, of where there's excess tension, because the activity is like, like this, the receptivity is a very, like expanded state that doesn't have vectors. It's not focused in any way. It's just being within itself. And so the mobility, the activity, does have a vector to it. And so there is a kind of um, movement in a direction, or, a kind of boundary or a kind of containment that's different in this other form. But it's like oftentimes, we're doubling up on that or more, than what's necessary. So that's another thing to just explore, like, well, how little effort can I make to make this movement? And see, see what that feels like. And also, like when we're making our movement, a lot of times we're in this place. I think I'm going to go ahead and I think we're almost finished with this. Yeah. See if there's anything. Let me just finish reading this and then I'm going to stop this share here. And it says, the outer physical levels follow suit automatically as the psychological imbalance is straightened out. And this does not mean, however, that you cannot help from outside by cultivating and learning from the art of mobility and relaxation. By working at it from inside out and from outside in, the process will be speeded up and the harmony established faster. So approaching it kind of from both places. So that should mean that you're not seeing that anymore. Is that correct? Did that disappear? The
No, it's still here. I still see
You
it.
still see it? Okay.
Uh-huh.
All right. Let's see what's going on here. There
There
we
we
go.
go.
Okay. So yeah, there's can't remember now where I was going to go afterwards, but I get distracted, and if I'm not in my flow. But there's just this way that we're working more and more to kind of balance out this ability of relaxation and um, finding pleasure again in life. And so this positive pleasure, which is free of the fear of the movement, and is able to trust in our own expansion and that kind of thing, is sort of where we're hoping to move. And I think that we can really work to have more and more of these moments, because I think in a way the evolutionary process that's bigger than us that we're undergoing is going to continue to work with us and bring us more and more into learning how I've heard one channel describe it as surf the moment. It's like we're living from this momentary presence, and it's in that space that we have access to everything that we need. So I think in a way this practice of working in sensory in the moment, in this mobility and relaxation, um, and just understanding a little more about our unconscious inner places where we're frozen inside, and we came by that naturally. It's like that's how we protected ourselves in some way. And so we can't just make it go away, but we can help it thaw. We can go in and help it realize that it's safe for now, and it's like you have more resources than you did. And and a lot of what the Pathwork guide is saying is that it's like what we're defending and afraid of is the feeling, and it's because we didn't really release the feeling. We didn't know how, and we didn't have any support for it. And so we experienced trauma, and then we ended up um, sort of embodying the trauma, and it's never felt safe to let it go. And so it continues to kind of live inside of us in these various forms, of the um, tensions and the defenses, and that kind of thing. And so as we practice mobility and relaxation, we can also do another work, which is like really going in and meeting all of these places of tension and all of these places of constriction, and um, and stagnation, and whatever is there. And as we simply acknowledge them, and like kind of activate our inner resource of self and presence to be with them, then we become that thing that they didn't have. The support that can allow the trauma finally to be released. And people have an idea that this is something that is like, oh, we have to go back and experience the same horror, but it's not the feeling that's trapped in the body. Again, if you don't go to the story, or maybe you use the story for a minute just to access it, but you just stay in the feeling of the body, and allow that, like in some ways we've been holding on to it, and so we're helping the body. It's okay, you can let it go, and sometimes we don't believe ourselves in that, but there's this kind of negotiation that we have that gradually, slowly lets go of that. And then as it does, the body is able to digest it. It's able to experience through it, as an energy expression, and there might be, sobbing or, different expressions of feeling, but it's not attached to any, of the hard pain, any of the beliefs of the story. It's just a releasing of all of this from the body. And it feels different. It doesn't have the same kind of trauma with it, especially if we can, you know, learn to trust more and more to kind of let go into it. And then it's like, oh, ocean wave, that can break over us and go back out to sea, right? And then there's this kind of calm, this peace in the wake of it. And it becomes, again, a part of the flow and a part of the integration of the experience. Okay, well, I think, we're about where we need to end up here. So, um, again, may this help us sort of melt all of our ice and open to our own inner flow of this new rising spring life force, and open to, like trying to find a way to say yes to, maybe the things that seem difficult, that we have resistance to, because that also makes the efforting, have to come in. And when we can turn something that maybe is not our favorite thing to do, but we can find a reason or really understand our inner choice to do it, and connect with that, then I think, it helps, because the yes current is free of that resistance, and then it's so much of an easier movement through. And also, I've discovered, for the most part, difficulties don't arise, issues don't come up in that place, where if I'm sort of trying to make it happen with my ego, then I'm going to end up getting frustrated by something. So, okay, well, great to, have you with us again, Abby, and hope
Thank you,
others
Darlene.
on the call. I think I've got a few people listening in, so I hope you enjoyed this discussion.
I
And
did very, very much. Thank you so much. It's like a breath of fresh air and just feels food for my soul. So thank you so much.
great. Okay.
Take
And
care.
sometime, we'll have to, have you come on even as a guest or something, and maybe see if we can explore together or something. I don't know. We'll see. Maybe we can talk about that at a conference or something.
Okay, that
Okay.
sounds good.
Yeah. Okay.
Take care and thank you so much again.
Right. You too. Take
Bye
care.
bye.